The ticking of the clock in Jonas Merritt's bank and lending was the only sound that dared compete with his voice. "Mrs. Townsend," he said, sliding a folder toward her with deliberate care, "your note on the property was due at the end of March. It is now July. That makes 3 months overdue." Catherine sat straight in the wooden chair across from him, gloved hands folded on her lap. The lace on her cuffs was clean but frayed, the sort of detail Merritt noticed and enjoyed. "I'm aware of the date," she said evenly. Merritt leaned back, chair creaking under his bulk. His mustache twitched with something close to amusement. Awareness isn't the same as payment. From the window behind him, the town's main street shimmered in summer heat. Catherine could see the dust rising off wagon wheels, the shadow of a horse passing. A world that went on turning, indifferent to whether she kept her home or not. She met his gaze. "The spring rains ruined half my crop. I'll make payment after harvest. That's a promise you've made before," he said, tapping the papers. "But the bank can't live on promises, Mrs. Townsend, not even yours." Her jaw tightened. "You've lived off men's promises long enough." His brows shot up. "Now, there's no need for bitterness." "No," she said softly, "but there is need for fairness." He sighed theatrically and stood, walking to the window as though the sight of Silverleaf Crossing might steady his patience. "The way I see it, Catherine, you're a capable woman but a lonely one. A farm like yours needs a man's hand, someone who can keep accounts straight, do the heavy work, make sure—" "Make sure I don't embarrass the town by surviving without one?" she interrupted. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "I only mean, some things are practical truths. You can't run a homestead and fight the elements alone forever. A woman alone is—" He paused, searching for a polite word, but none came. "Vulnerable." Catherine rose. Her chair scraped against the floor, a single sound louder than his condescension. "You may tell your wife," she said, "that her gossip has finally taken root in your business." She turned toward the door. Behind her, Merritt called out, "You've 30 days before I start proceedings. I'd rather see you married than homeless, Mrs. Townsend. Perhaps that's still an option." The room behind her was already fading into heat and dust as she stepped out onto Main Street. Every head turned, the storekeeper's wife pretending to rearrange fabric bolts, the postmaster pretending to sort mail. Their glances landed on her like cinders. Catherine adjusted her hat and began walking. Her boots pressed sharp tracks into the dust, as if she meant to carve her own trail out of the gossip, out of the pity, out of the silence that waited at home. She didn't slow until the road curved toward the open prairie. The sound of town, laughter, voices, horses, gave way to wind and the cry of distant hawks. Her hands trembled once, only once, before she clenched them. "He won't take it," she whispered aloud to no one, "not while I'm breathing." And the wind, dry and constant, seemed to answer back, whispering through the grass, "Then breathe, Catherine Townsend. Breathe and fight." The sun was sinking by the time Catherine reached the narrow path that wound down to her land. The house came into view first, a squat, weathered shape of gray timber, its porch leaning slightly as though the years had bowed its back. The wheat field behind it was patchy and thin, gold in the dying light but brittle where the rain had failed them. Her dog, a gray mutt named Bramble, padded up from the barn, tail low. He gave a soft bark, more habit than greeting. Catherine stooped to scratch his ear. "You're the only one who doesn't ask what I plan to do," she murmured. The door hinges groaned when she pushed them open. Inside, the house was neat, scrubbed, and utterly still. The faint smell of soap, wood smoke, and lavender lingered from the morning's cleaning, the smell of someone trying to control what she could. Her gaze moved to the mantel. Matthew's Bible sat there, the leather cracked, a sprig of dried pine still marking the last verse he'd read before he'd gone down to the mine that final day. She hadn't moved it since. Catherine hung her hat and gloves, then went to the small table near the window. A loaf of bread, half gone, sat beneath a towel. She tore a piece absently, chewing without hunger. The room creaked around her. The sigh of the boards, the rustle of wind under the eaves, the small sounds of a house too used to quiet. She crossed to the trunk by the bed and lifted the lid. Inside were Matthew's shirts, folded and smelling faintly of cedar. Beneath them a photograph, their wedding portrait, his arm awkwardly around her shoulders, both smiling like people certain the world would keep its promises. She traced his face with one finger. "You built this place with your hands," she whispered. "I've tried to keep it the same, but the land doesn't listen to me the way it did to you." Outside, a shutter banged loose in the wind. She didn't move to fix it. For a long time, she sat on the edge of the bed with the photograph in her lap, listening to the lonely rhythm of the boards in the floor and the creak of the roof beams. Then, as dusk deepened, she rose and went to the mantel. Her hand hovered over the Bible. After a moment, she opened it. The page fell to Romans, the handwriting in the margin unmistakably Matthew's. Hope that is seen is not hope. Her breath caught. "Then what am I meant to see, Lord?" she said softly, "because I don't see anything left." A gust rattled the window pane, sending the flame of the lamp fluttering. She closed the Bible gently and blew out the light. The last color drained from the room until it was only shapes and silence. Catherine stood a while longer in the dark, the widow of Silverleaf, keeper of a half-dead field, and a faith that had gone quiet. When she finally lay down, she didn't cry. She only listened to the wind, steady and cold, moving through the wheat like a whisper she couldn't quite understand. The rooster from the Evans farm crowed long before dawn, and by the time Catherine stepped outside, the first light was spilling across the field in pale gold. The air still carried a cool edge, and her breath made small clouds as she filled a pail from the well. The pump handle groaned. The sound was steady, familiar, almost comforting. Then, from down the road, came the rattle of wagon wheels. Catherine straightened, the pail swinging from her hand. The sound grew louder until she could make out the shape of a cart, dust rising behind it, the driver's bonnet ribbons flapping in the wind. "Lord, help me," she muttered. "Clara." Sure enough, Clara Evans waved before the cart had even come to a full stop. She was plump, red-faced from the sun, and full of more opinions than most preachers. "Catherine Townsend," she called, by climbing down before the wheels had stopped turning. "You'd think a woman with your good sense would answer a letter once in a while." Catherine set the pail on the well's edge. "Good morning to you too, Clara." "Don't you start with that polite tone." Clara brushed dust from her skirts, then pulled a basket from the cart. "Brought you eggs and bread. You'd think a widow'd keep a hen or two, but no, your pride wouldn't allow it." Catherine hid a smile. "My pride's got nothing to do with foxes taking half my coop last winter." Clara sniffed, unimpressed. "Foxes don't take all your hens unless you let them. You've been letting too many things happen lately." She pushed past Catherine and into the house like she owned the place. "Mercy, this room's quiet enough to wake the dead. Do you even talk to yourself anymore?" "Only when the silence gets loud," Catherine said dryly. "That's what I thought." Clara dropped the basket on the table and turned, planting her hands on her hips. "Jonas Merritt came by my place yesterday." Catherine's back stiffened. "Did he?" Said he gave you 30 days. Then you already know how the conversation went." Clara pursed her lips. "You've got to do something, Kath. Sell off a few acres, take in a boarder, anything but let that man steal what Matthew built." "I won't sell," Catherine said. Her voice came out sharper than she meant. Clara didn't flinch. "Then you'll need help." "I manage fine." Clara's eyes softened. "You manage alone. That's not the same thing." Catherine turned to the window. Beyond the glass, the wheat swayed faintly in the breeze, thin but stubborn. "I can't afford hired help." "I wasn't talking about hired help." Silence hung between them, filled with the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Finally, Catherine sighed. "If you're about to say what I think you are, don't." "I haven't said anything yet. You're thinking it loud enough." Clara folded her arms. "A mail-order husband isn't a shameful thing anymore, Catherine. Out here, most women marry for survival as much as for love. You'd have your land, your name, and your dignity. And you might even find someone who deserves you." Catherine laughed once, the sound bitter. "A husband from the papers? That's desperation." "It's practical," Clara said firmly. "And you know as well as I do, men out west are looking for good women. You'd have a choice. You could pick one with decent manners, someone you could trust." Catherine turned from the window. "And what if the man who comes isn't what he claims to be?" "Then you send him packing," Clara said. "But at least you'll have tried something." Catherine shook her head. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple. You're running out of time, Catherine. God helps those who move their feet." That made Catherine pause. She looked toward the mantel where Matthew's Bible sat. "I'll pray on it," she said quietly. Clara smiled, satisfied. "You do that. But don't take too long. Silverleaf's full of people waiting to see you fall, and I'd dearly like to disappoint them." The sound of Clara's cart faded slowly down the dirt road, its wheels grinding over gravel until only the wind remained. Catherine stood on the porch long after her friend had gone, arms crossed, watching the dust settle. The evening sun had turned the fields to fire, and for a brief moment the wheat looked full again, gold and alive. But when she blinked, the illusion vanished, leaving only thin, tired stalks swaying in the breeze. Inside, the silence returned. Brambles snored softly by the hearth. The air smelled faintly of bread and lamp oil. Catherine sat at the small table near the window, resting her elbows on the wood. Clara's words still pressed against her ribs like stones. "You're running out of time." She looked at Matthew's Bible on the mantelpiece, then at the stack of unpaid bills folded neatly beneath it. The paper crackled faintly when she touched it. She rose and went to the cupboard. From the top shelf, she pulled down her box of writing things, ink, a quill pen, and a few sheets of good paper she'd saved for seed orders. She set them on the table and stared. "Desperation," she whispered. "That's what this is." The lamp flame quivered when she lit it. In its glow, her face looked pale and older than she remembered. She uncorked the ink bottle, dipped the pen, and hesitated. The page remained white, accusingly pure. She started to write, then stopped, then began again, crossing out each first attempt until finally she found the courage, or exhaustion, to continue. "To whom it may concern, my name is Catherine Townsend, age 34, widow residing near Silverleaf Crossing in Colorado Territory. I seek a man of good character, sober habits, and honest intentions, willing to share in the work and keeping of a small farm. I offer shelter, fair partnership, and the respect due any husband. Faith in God is desired, though I do not ask perfection, only truth. C. Townsend." She read it twice, then blew on the ink to dry it. The words looked plain, almost cold, but she could not bear to make them warmer. Reaching for an envelope, she paused again. "What am I doing?" she murmured. Her fingers trembled slightly as she sealed the letter. The wax dripped unevenly, forming a scarlet blotch. When she was finished, she sat still for a long while, listening to the clock tick. The sound of it filled the room like a heartbeat that wasn't her own. Finally, she whispered into the quiet, "Lord, if I'm wrong, stop me now." But nothing stopped her. The next morning, when she walked into Silverleaf to post the letter, she kept her chin high, though her stomach twisted with every step. And when she slid the envelope into the outgoing mail slot, it felt as though she had dropped a piece of her pride along with it. It would be weeks before any reply came. But as Catherine turned to leave the post office, a gust of mountain wind swept through the door, cool, strong, and carrying the faint scent of rain. For the first time in months, she smiled. The heat had settled over Silverleaf like a thick wool blanket by the time Catherine tied up her horse outside the post office. The street shimmered with the weight of summer, dust clinging to boots, the faint metallic scent of rain that never quite arrived. She hadn't meant to ride into town that day. There were fences needing mending, and the Eastfield still waiting for the second planting. But Clara had written that she'd be baking, and Catherine had promised to bring her more sugar from the mercantile. So she went. That was all. At least, that was what she told herself. The little brass bell over the post office door jingled as she stepped inside. Mr. Kettering, the postmaster, looked up from behind his counter. He was a kind man in his 60s, white hair sticking up like dandelion fluff, spectacles perched halfway down his nose. "Well now," he said, squinting. "If it isn't Mrs. Townsend, haven't seen you in a spell." "Been busy," she said. "Haven't we all?" he chuckled. "Hotter than a blacksmith's forge these days. What can I do for you?" "Just checking if any letters came in." She tried to make her voice casual. He rummaged through the pigeonholes, muttering to himself. "Merritt, Mitchell. Ah, Townsend." Her stomach tightened. Kettering straightened, holding a single envelope. "Got one here. Postmarks from Kansas City. Looks like a man's hand, wouldn't you say?" Catherine reached for it before he could say more. "Thank you." He nodded, though his eyes twinkled behind his glasses. "Nothing like good news in a man's handwriting. Or bad," she murmured. He pretended not to hear and returned to his ledgers. Catherine stepped back into the sunlight, the envelope clutched in her gloved hand. For a long time she didn't move. The sound of wagon wheels and distant hammering filled the air, but she heard none of it. The paper was thick, the ink slightly smudged from travel. Across the front, her name, Mrs. Catherine Townsend, had been written in careful, deliberate strokes. The handwriting was plain, unpracticed, the kind of script that belonged to a man more familiar with tools than penmanship. She turned it over, ran her thumb along the seal. Then she tucked it into her pocket and walked toward Clara's house. That night, the lamp burned low on the kitchen table. Brambles slept at her feet, and the fields outside whispered softly under a light wind. The envelope lay before her, unopened still. She had set it there hours ago, meaning to finish her supper first, meaning to read it later. But she couldn't stop glancing at it. Finally, she drew her knife and sliced the seal. The paper crackled faintly as she unfolded it. The handwriting was steady but uneven. The ink faded in places. Dear Mrs. Townsend, I read your advertisement some 3 times before I thought myself fool enough to write. My name is Thomas Hale, age 36, presently working as a hired hand with a freight line near Abilene. I have no property of my own and not much in the way of savings, but I know honest work and am not afraid of hard days. I was raised Methodist, though I haven't seen a proper church in a while. I believe in God's mercy, though I reckon he's still teaching me what to do with it. I am not a man of fine words. I've known more winters than warm beds and more loss than most would care to hear about. But if you are truly looking for someone to share the burden and the bread, I'll come. If you'd rather not, then burn this letter and I'll take no offense. Thomas Hale. Catherine stared at the page, her heart slow and unsteady. It wasn't a love letter. There were no flattery, no poetic promises, none of the boasting she half expected, just plain truth. And something else beneath it, quiet, bruised faith, like a man still learning how to speak after years of silence. She folded the letter carefully, then unfolded it again. Outside, a night bird called. Thomas Hale, she said softly, testing the name. Bramble's ears twitched. She smiled faintly. Sounds like the kind of man who doesn't lie easy. The clock on the mantel ticked, steady and slow. She read the letter once more before setting it down, then whispered the same prayer she'd spoken the night she sent her own. Lord, if I'm wrong, stop me now. And again, nothing stopped her. Only the sound of the wind, soft, almost approving, moving through the cracks of the window pane. The dust along the Abilene freight yard clung to everything. Skin, boots, breath. It was a living thing. That dust, curling in the air like it meant to outlast every man alive. Thomas Hale wiped his brow with the back of his wrist and leaned on his shovel. His shirt was patched, his trousers held by a length of rope where the belt had given up months ago. Break time, Hale, someone shouted. He nodded without looking up. The others scattered toward the water barrel, laughing about wages or poker or women in town. He stayed where he was, staring at the wagon he'd just finished unloading. The foreman's boy came running down the yard. Mr. Hale. Thomas turned, frowning. What is it, Eli? Post came early. Found this with your name on it. The boy held out an envelope, edges smudged with dirt. Thomas took it slowly, his name, Mr. Thomas Hale, written in a woman's neat, black, careful hand. For a long moment he didn't move. His chest felt tight, his throat dry. Thanks, he said finally. Eli grinned. From a lady, is it? From the Lord, maybe, Thomas muttered. When the boy left, Thomas sat down on an overturned crate. The wind kicked grit against his boots as he opened the envelope. Mr. Hale, I received your letter and thought on it many nights before answering. Your honesty spoke to me more than any fine words could have. I have no riches either, only a small homestead, worn land, and the will to keep it alive. If you are still of a mind to come, you will find in me a fair companion, though I make no promises of ease. My faith has been tested, but it stands. I seek not a rescuer, but a partner. Should this suit you, come to Silverleaf Crossing in Colorado Territory. The stage arrives every other Tuesday. I'll meet it myself. Catherine Townsend. Thomas read the letter twice, the second time slower. There was something in her tone that steadied him, plain and steady as oak. Not pleading, not coy, just real. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it inside his vest pocket. The foreman's whistle sounded, sharp against the wind. Thomas stood. His back ached, his hands were raw, and his pay for the week barely filled his tin cup. He looked toward the horizon, where the sun hung low and fierce. Silverleaf Crossing, he said under his breath. Sounds like a place a man could begin again. He quit the freight yard that evening. No one stopped him. No one even asked where he was going. Men like Thomas Hale came and went like weather. By nightfall, he was walking west, a threadbare coat slung over his shoulder, and Catherine Townsend's letter pressed close to his heart. The road stretched endless and empty beneath a white-hot sky. Thomas walked until the soles of his boots split, then tied them together with strips of cloth. He slept beneath wagons, under stars, in barns when someone took pity. One night, outside a small town near the Colorado line, he found shelter at a mission house. The pastor there, an old man with eyes like pale glass, offered him stew and a cot. "You traveling far?" the pastor asked. Thomas nodded. "Far enough to start over." The pastor studied him. "You've the look of a man who's lost much." "Maybe just enough," Thomas said quietly. "Then you're right where God can reach you," the old man replied. They prayed together that night, simple words, halting but sincere. Thomas had forgotten how prayer could sound when spoken aloud. By morning, he was back on the road, coat buttoned tight against the wind. When he finally reached the foothills, his reflection in a stream startled him. Sunburned skin, beard grown wild, clothes frayed and caked in travel dust. He looked less like a husband-to-be and more like a beggar. He laughed once, a dry, disbelieving sound. "Lord, she'll turn me away at first sight." But something inside him whispered back, "She won't," and so, with blistered feet and a heart full of fear and stubborn hope, Thomas Hale took the final miles towards Silverleaf Crossing. The stagecoach arrived just before noon, wheels screaming against the rutted street. The sound drew people from every direction. The smith wiping his hands on a rag, the tailor's apprentice leaning from a window, even Jonas Merritt stepping out of his bank to watch. Silverleaf never missed an arrival. Catherine stood a little apart from the crowd, her hat drawn low against the sun, gloves clasped before her. She'd told no one why she was there. Not Clara, not the gossips at church. She had simply said she expected a letter, though her heart hadn't believed her own excuse. When the coach finally stopped, a cloud of dust drifted past her skirts. The driver jumped down first, calling for water for the horses. Then two passengers emerged, a traveling salesman with shiny boots and a woman clutching a crying baby. Catherine's stomach dropped. No one else stepped forward. She told herself it was fine, that perhaps he had changed his mind or missed the coach in Abilene. She began to turn away when a voice from the rear shouted, "Hold the door a moment." The driver swore softly. Then, from the shadowed interior, a tall figure unfolded itself, stooping beneath the low roof before stepping down into the sunlight. Gasps rippled through the bystanders. He was barefoot. His coat was torn, shirt threadbare, his hair sun-bleached and unkempt. He carried a single bundle tied in canvas, and the dust of 100 miles clung to every inch of him. Catherine's hand went to her throat. Thomas Hale looked like a man who'd wrestled the earth and barely survived. Yet his posture was straight, his expression calm, his eyes clear gray and steady, searching the faces around him until they found hers. Something flickered there. Recognition. Relief. Then hesitation. He took a step toward her. The crowd parted, whispering. "Mrs. Townsend?" he asked. His voice was quiet, roughened by travel. Catherine swallowed. "Mr. Hale." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Someone muttered, "He's the husband she sent for?" Jonas Merritt, standing near the bank door, gave a low laugh that reached her ears. Thomas's gaze shifted toward the sound, but didn't linger. He looked back at Catherine instead. "You came." "I said I would," she answered. Her tone was even, but her pulse raced. "And so did you," he nodded once, "by God's grace and stubbornness." The driver tossed down his bundle. "That all your belongings, mister?" "Yes," Thomas said simply. Catherine hesitated only a moment before she bent to pick it up herself. "Come on, then. The house is a mile out." She turned before he could answer. Her face was pale beneath her hat brim, but her voice held firm. "I'll not have the town staring longer than it already has." Thomas followed her through the heat, his long stride catching up easily, though he limped slightly. Behind them, the whispers swelled like a tide. The road wound west, away from Silverleaf, through stretches of open grass and wild sage. A hawk wheeled high above them, its cry cutting through the quiet. For a long time they walked without speaking. Finally, Catherine said, "You look like you've come a long way." Thomas gave a soft laugh. "I suppose that's one way to say it." You didn't have a horse? Sold it 2 weeks back. Bought passage for the last leg. She nodded slowly. That must have been hard. He glanced at her. You're thinking I look it. I'm thinking you survived it. He smiled faintly. Barely, but I'm here. They walked another few yards before he added, I'd meant to come looking more like a husband and less like a scarecrow. Catherine's lips twitched before she could stop them. I've seen worse. Truly? Yes, though not often. That made him laugh, low and genuine. The sound startled her with its warmth. He grew quiet again, then said, I don't have much to offer you, Mrs. Townsend. Neither do I, she replied, so perhaps we'll be even. The road turned, and the Townsend homestead came into view, a small house standing alone against the wide horizon. Thomas slowed. You did all this yourself? After my husband died, yes. He nodded with quiet respect. You've strength in you. Strength isn't always a choice. No, he said softly, but it's still rare. The words hung between them, simple and sincere. For the first time since she'd written that letter, Catherine felt something other than fear. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something like the first breath after a long winter. The Townsend homestead stood at the edge of a low rise, looking out over fields gone pale with evening light. A windmill creaked, slow and steady above the pump. The porch boards groaned as Catherine stepped onto them, the old screen door sagging a little on one hinge. She turned the latch and pushed it open. Come in, she said. Her voice was calm, but her heart pounded hard enough she could feel it in her throat. Thomas hesitated on the step, one hand on the doorframe. His eyes took in the details, the clean-swept floorboards, the small table near the window, the Bible open beside a vase of half-wilted flowers. He removed his hat, a torn, sun-bleached thing, and ducked his head slightly before stepping inside. Smells like bread, he murmured. I bake on Sundays, she said. It keeps through the week if I'm careful. He nodded. That's good. The silence that followed was heavy but not unpleasant. Catherine busied herself with her gloves, removing them carefully. There's water at the pump out back, she said, if you'd like to wash. I'd be obliged. She nodded toward the door. There's a towel on the rail. When he stepped out, she allowed herself a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. His presence filled the house, not just his size, but the quiet way he looked at things, as though measuring the weight of every detail. Through the window, she watched him work the pump handle, rolling up his sleeves. The muscles in his arms flexed with the motion. He cupped the cold water in his hands, rubbed it across his face, his neck, his hair, then stood there a long moment, staring westward as if listening to something she couldn't hear. When he came back inside, his hair was darkened by water, and his expression had softened, though the lines of exhaustion were still there. I'll sleep in the barn, he said, setting his bundle by the wall, until you're comfortable having me here. Catherine's chin lifted slightly. You'll sleep in the spare room, she said. His brows drew together. That's kind, but unnecessary. I won't have my husband sleeping with the animals. The town gossips would have a feast of it. He gave a quiet chuckle. I see. Best keep up appearances, then. Exactly, he nodded once. All right. I'll behave. Catherine turned away quickly to hide the smallest smile tugging at her lips. The meal was simple. Cornbread, beans, and the last of the ham from the smokehouse. Catherine set 2 plates on the table. Thomas bowed his head for a moment before eating. She noticed, and after a pause, she did the same. They ate mostly in silence at first, the air filled with the sounds of the ticking clock and the night wind pushing against the shutters. After a while, Thomas said, This place suits you. Catherine looked up. It's all I have left of him. He nodded. Your husband. Yes, he died 3 winters ago. I'm sorry. So am I, she said simply. He set down his fork. If it helps any, I didn't come here thinking I could replace him. Her gaze met his, steady, unreadable. That's good, she said. Because you can't. He nodded once. Understood. The words could have settled hard between them, but instead they seemed to open something quieter, a space for truth. After a while, she asked, What did you do before this? Thomas chewed thoughtfully, then said, Worked land mostly. Ran a small mill up near Helena before it burned. How did it burn? Lightning, maybe. Carelessness, more likely. And after that, he smiled faintly, after that, I stopped building things that could burn. There was a pause, then Catherine said softly, And yet, you came here. He looked at her with something almost like gratitude. Maybe some fires are worth risking again. The clock ticked on. Catherine rose to clear the dishes, but he stood as well. Let me. It's fine. I insist, he said, and took the plates gently from her hands. She hesitated, then stepped aside. Watching him wash dishes in her sink, this ragged stranger with a calmness she didn't yet understand, something within her shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of peace. By morning, the wind had shifted, carrying the scent of rain that never came. The world outside the window was gray and still, the kind of quiet that makes a person think twice before speaking. Catherine buttoned her plain cotton dress and tied her shawl close. From the kitchen doorway, she said, I'll be in town before noon. We're low on flour. Thomas, crouched by the hearth, looked up from where he was splitting kindling. Do you want me to come with you? No, she said quickly, then softer. You'll have enough to do here. He studied her face but said nothing. Instead, he set aside the hatchet and stood. I'll mend the corral fence while you're gone. The west post's half rotted. Her eyes flicked toward the window where the pasture stretched wide. You noticed that already? Hard to miss, he said. It leans like a drunkard. Despite herself, she smiled. Well then. Don't let it fall completely before I get back. He tipped his head. I'll try not to. She left him there, standing in the morning light that fell in narrow stripes across the floor, and made her way down the rutted road toward town. Silverleaf was already humming when she arrived. The clatter of wagons, the murmur of merchants setting out their wares, the faint metallic sound of the blacksmith's hammer, all as familiar as her own heartbeat. But as soon as she stepped onto Main Street, conversation seemed to falter. Mrs. Everett, the storekeeper's wife, leaned across the counter to whisper something to a friend. Two men outside the saloon paused mid-laugh, eyes following Catherine as she passed. It was always like this when news traveled, and in Silverleaf, news moved faster than truth. She held her head high, as she always did. The doorbell above the general store jingled as she entered. Jonas Merritt was there, of course hat in hand, pretending to browse bolts of cloth he'd never buy. He turned, that small smile curling at the corner of his mouth. Mrs. Townsend, he said smoothly. Or should I say ale? Catherine met his gaze. Say whichever makes you least happy, Mr. Merritt. His smile widened slightly. So it's true, then. You really sent for him. I did. And he arrived. He did. Jonas tilted his head. And in such condition. Catherine's hands tightened around the folded list she carried. He's a man who's worked for his living, not one who inherited it. A flicker of something. Amusement, resentment, crossed Jonas's face. Work's one thing, Catherine. Respectability is another. The town's concerned. The town, she said evenly, can mind its own fields. She walked past him, selected her sack of flour and salt, and laid the coins on the counter. Her hands did not tremble. When she left, the bell jingled again, bright and final. By the time Catherine reached home, the sky had turned dark as pewter. Thomas was still outside, hammering a new crossbeam into place. His shirt clung to him with rain, the sleeves rolled high, his movements steady and sure despite the storm. She dropped her basket on the porch and ran toward him. You'll catch your death out here. He looked up, squinting against the rain. Almost done. You'll be struck by lightning if you're not careful. He grinned through the downpour. Then you'll have to write another agency, won't you? She gasped despite herself, half scandalized, half amused. You're impossible. Only sometimes, he said, driving one last nail before straightening. When they ran back toward the house, Catherine caught herself laughing, a sound so unfamiliar it startled her. Thomas held the door for her, dripping onto the floorboards. Inside, the rain pounded against the roof like applause. He stood near the hearth, water dripping from his hair. I didn't mean to worry you, he said softly. Catherine crossed her arms, cheeks flushed. You didn't. He smiled a little. Good. But her eyes betrayed her. He saw it. The faint tremor in her jaw, the way her breath caught. She busied herself with the fire. You'll need to dry those clothes before you catch a chill. Yes, ma'am, he said, teasing gently. I mean it. He nodded, then peeled off his soaked shirt, wringing it out over the basin. She turned quickly away, pretending to stir the stew she'd forgotten on the stove. When she looked back, he was standing by the flames, his shoulders broad and scarred, the kind of scars that spoke of hard years and harder lessons. Something in her heart shifted again. this time more sharply. For the first time, she saw not just the man she'd sent for, but the man who had come. By dawn, the rain had gone, leaving the earth heavy with scent, wet soil, sage, and cedar smoke from the stove. A low fog clung to the pasture, and drops of water clung to the fence posts like bits of glass. Catherine stepped outside with her shawl wrapped tight, breathing in the cool. Thomas was already at work. He moved with steady rhythm, resetting the trough, checking the roof shingles where the wind had pried one loose. The hammer in his hand struck with even, patient rhythm. He wasn't fast, but everything he touched looked truer once he'd finished with it. When he noticed her standing there, he lifted his head but didn't stop working. "Morning, Mrs. Hale." "Morning," she answered, then added after a pause, "You're an early riser." He smiled slightly. "The daylight's the only thing out here that doesn't cost a man." She found herself smiling before she meant to. "You make work look easy." "It isn't," he said simply, "but it's honest." He bent to gather the nails scattered on the ground. His movements were quiet, careful, no show in him, just purpose. Catherine stood there longer than she intended, watching the way his shoulders moved beneath his clean shirt, how he paused now and then to study the sky as if taking measure of the day. At last she said, "Breakfast is ready, if you'll wash up." He nodded, setting the hammer down. "Yes, ma'am." And though she told herself she'd only been courteous, the corner of her mouth betrayed her with the faintest curve of warmth. Clara Densmore arrived late that morning, all bustle and opinion, her bonnet slightly askew from the wind. "Well," she said as she stepped onto the porch, "I've heard plenty from town, but I thought I'd better see the situation with my own eyes." Catherine met her friend with polite calm. "And what situation would that be exactly?" "Oh, you know how people talk. Half of Silverleaf swears your husband's an escaped convict. The other half's betting you married him out of pity." Catherine's jaw tightened. "Both halves are wrong." Clara's eyes sparkled. "So I told them. But tell me, is he as rough as they say?" "Clara," Catherine said warningly, "I'm only asking. A woman's entitled to curiosity." Before Catherine could respond, Thomas stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He stopped when he saw the visitor, then tipped his hat politely. "Ma'am." Clara blinked. "Well, you're not what I expected." "That good or bad?" he asked, smiling faintly. "Good," she admitted. "You've a decent manner about you, not what gossip makes of you at all." "Gossip's a poor judge of character," Thomas said mildly. Clara laughed. "Then you'll do fine in this town. You've already said the truest thing anyone has all week." As he went back toward the pasture, Clara turned to Catherine, lowering her voice. "He's handsome." "Clara? Well, he is, and polite, and working before breakfast, by the look of him. Are you sure you sent for him just to fix fences?" Catherine's cheeks flushed. "I sent for him because I needed help." Clara murmured. "That's what they all say at first." Catherine turned away, but her heart beat faster. By afternoon, the sun had burned away the last of the storm clouds. Thomas was at the roadside, sleeves rolled, helping old George Taylor repair his broken wagon axle. Catherine stood at the gate, a basket in her hand, pretending to watch her chickens while her eyes followed him instead. He didn't know she was watching. When the work was done, George clapped him on the shoulder. "You've got a good hand for this kind of thing, Hale. Don't know what Silverleaf did before you showed up." Thomas smiled modestly. "Seems to me you've managed fine without me." George laughed. "Aye, but I'd rather manage with you next time." As the old man climbed back into his wagon, Catherine felt a strange warmth settle in her chest, half pride, half something more dangerous. When Thomas came back up the path, she said, "You didn't have to help him." He shrugged. "Didn't hurt me to." She hesitated. "You're making yourself known around here." "Is that a problem?" "It's unexpected." He studied her face for a long moment. "You worry what people will say." "I always have," she admitted. He nodded. "Then let them say it. You and I will live the truth." Catherine didn't answer right away. The wind caught the edge of her shawl, lifting it slightly. Finally, she said, "That's harder than it sounds." "Most honest things are." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. An understanding, fragile but sure. The sound of the windmill filled the silence between them, slow and steady. By late afternoon, the air had grown heavy again, thick with dust from the road and the dry hum of grasshoppers. Catherine had spent the day baking, kneading dough, tending the stove, and hauling water until her arms trembled. She was pulling the last loaf from the oven when her vision blurred. The edges of the room seemed to tilt. She gripped the counter for balance. Catherine? Thomas's voice came from the doorway. He crossed the room in 2 strides, catching her elbow just as her knees softened. I'm fine, she said sharply. It's only the heat. Sit, he said, his tone quiet but firm. I said I'm fine. He didn't argue. He simply guided her into the chair, his hands steady on her arm. You've been on your feet since sunrise. She tried to rise again, but the room swayed once more, forcing her to lean forward with a faint gasp. Thomas knelt beside her, eyes level with hers. When's the last time you ate? She blinked. Breakfast. It's near sundown. Her breath hitched. I didn't notice. He shook his head slightly, rising to pour her a cup of water. You notice everything else, but not yourself. Catherine took the cup reluctantly. You make me sound careless. Not careless, he said softly. Just used to doing it all alone. She looked at him, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. And what would you know about that? He hesitated, then said, more than I'd like. He told her to stay seated, but she couldn't help watching as he worked, awkward at first, then with growing confidence. He sliced bread, ladled stew, poured a bit of honey into her cup without spilling a drop. You've done this before, she said finally. He looked over his shoulder. Had a sister once. She'd take sick come winter, and someone had to feed her. Catherine's hands tightened in her lap. Had? She passed. Long time ago. The simplicity in his tone made her chest ache. I'm sorry, she said. He shrugged one shoulder, though his eyes betrayed the weight of it. Some days, I still talk to her when I'm working. Makes the silence less sharp. He brought her the bowl and set it before her. Eat. Slowly. She tried a spoonful. The broth was simple but rich, the kind of food that warmed from the inside out. You cook better than I'd expect of a man who fixes fences. He smiled faintly. It's all the same. Measure right, don't rush, keep the fire even. She laughed softly, and for a moment the distance between them disappeared. After she'd eaten, he gathered the dishes without asking, humming low under his breath. Catherine leaned back, exhaustion washing over her, but it was a peaceful kind of tired, a letting go she hadn't allowed herself in years. She woke later to the sound of soft rain and the faint glow of the fire. Thomas sat by the hearth, elbows on his knees, staring into the flames. You should sleep, she murmured. He looked over, startled that she was awake. Didn't mean to wake you. You didn't. He turned back to the fire. Couldn't sleep much anyhow. The roof leaks in the spare room. I'd meant to fix that, she said, her voice hoarse. You've meant to fix a dozen things. You don't have to do them all. She smiled weakly. You've said that twice today. I'll keep saying it till you believe me. Silence stretched between them, comfortable this time. Finally, she asked, Thomas, why did you come? Truly. He was quiet for a long time before answering. Because a man can work himself to the bone and still be empty. I thought maybe if I worked for someone else, for something that mattered, it'd fill the space. And does it? She asked softly. He met her eyes. I don't know yet, but I'm closer than I was. Catherine's throat tightened. She turned toward the window, where rain traced thin silver lines down the glass. I used to pray, she said, every night after James died, but after a while it felt like praying to an empty room. Thomas nodded slowly. Maybe it wasn't empty. Maybe you just got tired of waiting for an answer. She looked at him again. The firelight caught the edge of his face, quiet, scarred, honest. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in her house. And for the first time since her husband's death, she whispered a prayer, not to be spared or saved, but simply to understand. The morning broke hard and clear after the rain. The air smelled of washed dust and pine. Catherine was tending the small garden behind the house, humming softly, when she heard the distant clop of hooves. Thomas had gone into town for nails and lamp oil. She straightened, shading her eyes. A lone rider was coming up the road, a tall man on a dark horse, coat long and worn at the cuffs. He rode with an ease that spoke of years on the trail. When he reached the gate, he reined in and tipped his hat. Morning, ma'am, he said, his voice gravel-deep, polite but edged. Catherine gripped her apron. Morning. Can I help you? I'm looking for a man by the name of Thomas Hale. Folks said he's been staying out here. Her stomach tightened. He's not here at the moment. What's your business? The stranger smiled faintly. Old business. Ought to see him when he returns. He swung down from his horse with a fluid motion that spoke of practiced strength. Name's Arthur Leary. We rode together once out past Helena. Catherine forced a polite nod. I'll tell him you came by. Arthur leaned his elbow on the gatepost, studying her with eyes the color of storm water. You his wife, then? I am. Well, he said slowly, then maybe you'll forgive me for asking if you know what kind of man you married. Her pulse jumped. I know enough. He tilted his head. Do you? Because the last I saw him, there was a body on the ground and a sheriff 2 days behind us. Catherine's breath caught. That's not true. Arthur smiled, easy and cold. Maybe. Maybe not. Just thought you ought to hear it from someone who was there. He swung back into the saddle, tipped his hat again, and rode off without another word, dust rising behind him. Catherine stood there, the world suddenly too bright, the sound of the windmill loud in her ears. The sound of wagon wheels reached her before the sight of them. Thomas came up the road near sundown, his shirt sleeves rolled, a new coil of rope and a sack of nails in the wagon bed. He waved when he saw her on the porch, but when he got closer, his smile faltered. What's wrong? Catherine's hands were clasped tight at her waist. A man came. Thomas's expression changed. He set the brake, stepping down slowly. What man? Arthur Leary. He froze. The color drained slightly from his face. He was here? Yes. What did he say? That you left a man dead in Helena. Thomas exhaled, slow and heavy. He didn't look away. He told you that much, did he? Is it true? He hesitated, not long, but long enough to make her heart tremble. Yes, he said finally, but not how he'd have you believe. She gripped the porch railing. Explain it to me. He took a step closer, but she didn't move. It was near 6 years ago, he said quietly. I worked at timber camp with Arthur. One night there was a fight. Drunken, stupid. A man drew a knife on another. I stepped between them. He fell on his own blade before I could stop him. Her throat went dry. And Arthur? Arthur ran before the law came. I stayed. Then why? The sheriff's brother was the one who died, Thomas said simply. Justice wasn't going to be found that night, so I left. He looked away then, his voice low. Every mile since has been penance. Catherine stared at him, trying to read the truth in his eyes. They were steady, not pleading, not proud, just open. Finally she whispered, Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't think you'd let me cross your gate if you knew. And now I'd rather you know me for what I am than love me for what I'm not. The words cut through the quiet like a prayer said too late. Catherine turned toward the door, her hand trembling on the knob. I need time. I'll give you all of it, he said softly. That night, Catherine sat by the window long after the lamp had burned low. Rain had started again, soft and slow. She watched it slide down the glass, blurring the world beyond. She thought of Arthur's voice, smooth and sharp, of Thomas's stillness, of every word that had passed between them. And she thought of the line in James's old Bible, one she hadn't read in years, judge not by appearances, but judge with righteous judgment. When dawn came, she rose and found Thomas sitting outside beneath the lean-to, his back against the wall, hat in his hands, eyes closed from a sleepless night. Catherine stepped into the cool morning light. You'll come inside, she said quietly. He looked up, uncertain. You sure? I'm sure. He stood slowly, searching her face for something. Anger, maybe. But all he found was resolve. I don't know what's ahead, she said, and I won't pretend I understand what happened, but I know what I see now. What's that? He asked. Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't waver. A man trying to live right, and that's enough for today. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Thomas nodded, his jaw tightening as if to keep something inside. Then I'll do my best to deserve tomorrow, he said. She stepped aside, letting him in, and as he crossed the threshold, the first sunlight of morning broke through the clouds and filled the small, quiet house. The morning after the storm, Silverleaf Crossing was already awake with gossip. At the general store, 2 women whispered over barrels of flour. At the blacksmith's, men stopped hammering long enough to murmur about that stranger living out by the Townsend farm. And at the sheriff's office, Arthur Leary leaned against the doorframe, a cigarette between his fingers and a story on his tongue. By the time the sun stood high, Sheriff George Latimer had heard enough to saddle his horse. Catherine was hanging laundry on the line when she heard the knock, a steady official rhythm. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. Morning, Mrs. Townsend, the sheriff said, tipping his hat. His mustache was damp with sweat, his badge catching the light. Is Mr. Hale home? He is, she said carefully. Is something wrong? Just need a word with him. Thomas stepped from the kitchen, wiping his hands. He'd been fixing the stove hinge. His eyes met the sheriff's, and something old and heavy settled in the air. Morning, Sheriff. Mr. Hale, Latimer said, polite but distant. Got a few questions about a man came through yesterday. Arthur Leary. Thomas nodded once. You've already spoken to him, then? I have, said the sheriff. He claims you, and he have unfinished business. That true? Thomas's voice was calm. Depends what kind of business he's talking about. Latimer's eyes narrowed. He says there was a killing in Helena, that you were there. I was, Thomas said simply. Catherine's breath caught, but she stayed quiet, standing near the hearth with her hands folded. Mind telling me how it happened? Latimer asked. Thomas met his gaze squarely. Man died in a fight, not by my hand. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. Helena sent word years back about a drifter named Hale wanted for questioning. Funny thing, never found him. Because I left before they could hang an innocent man, Thomas said, his jaw tight. You can ride to Helena and ask for the report. You'll find my name scratched off before the ink dried. The sheriff's gaze slid toward Catherine. You believe that, Mrs. Townsend? Her heart thudded once, hard. I do, she said, her voice steady, and I'll swear to it. Latimer let the silence hang. Then he sighed, tugging at his gloves. I'll ride to Helena. Till then, Mr. Hale, don't leave the county. I wasn't planning to, Thomas said. When the sheriff left, the sound of hooves faded down the road, and the house fell still. Thomas exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I'm sorry, he murmured. For what? Catherine asked softly. For bringing trouble to your door. She stepped closer. You didn't bring it. You faced it. He looked at her, eyes tired but warm. You don't know what that means to me. Catherine smiled faintly. I think I do. That night they prayed together for the first time. Not from habit or show, but from need. Thomas's voice was rough, uncertain, but earnest as he bowed his head. Lord, he said quietly, if I've got to stand for what's behind me, give me the strength to do it honest. And if you mean for me to stay, then don't let her pay the price for my past. Catherine's eyes stayed closed. Amen. When they rose, the lamplight touched both faces, two weary souls who had finally stopped hiding from Grace. Outside, the night wind passed through the wheat like a whisper. Sheriff Latimer rode at dawn, the hills washed in silver mist. He didn't relish the trip. Helena was 2 days' hard ride. But something about Thomas Hale's calm bothered him. A guilty man lied fast, an honest one carried silence like a cross. He rode steady, thinking of Catherine Townsend's eyes, clear, unwavering. A widow's word didn't clear a man, but it planted doubt in the soil where judgment grew. By the second night, the lights of Helena shone like small fires through the mountain fog. He went straight to the sheriff's office, a squat building that smelled of tobacco and damp paper. Name's George Latimer, Silverleaf Crossing, he said, flashing his badge. Looking for an old file, Helena fight, maybe 6 years back, one Thomas Hale mentioned in it. The clerk shuffled through the drawers, finally pulling out a thin, yellowed report. Here it is, the clerk said, tapping the corner. Bar fight turned deadly. Victim was Sam Leary, brother to a man named Arthur, the one that caused all the noise. Who killed him? The clerk's brow furrowed. Accidental death, according to witness statements. Knife slipped in the scuffle. No warrant out for Hale after the coroner's inquest. He left town clean. Latimer nodded slowly. Arthur Leary know that? The clerk chuckled dryly. Arthur ain't the sort to let go of a grudge, even if the Lord himself signed the pardon. By the time the sheriff left Helena, he knew what he had to do, and that he might be too late. Back in Silverleaf, the wind carried storm scent again. Catherine was in the yard collecting kindling when she saw the rider crest the ridge. But it wasn't the sheriff, it was Arthur. He came fast, dust trailing behind him like smoke. His horse was lathered, his coat thrown back, and his eyes looked fevered with hate. Catherine's heart thudded painfully. He reined in hard before the fence. Where's Hale? He shouted. Gone to town? She lied instantly. Arthur dismounted, stepping toward the gate. Don't play dumb, ma'am. I seen the smoke from your chimney last night. I said he's not here. Arthur smiled thinly. Then I'll wait. He pushed the gate open, walking toward the porch. Stop, Catherine said, her voice rising. You've no right to come on my land. He tilted his head. Lady, you don't know what kind of man you've taken in. He killed my brother. Her breath trembled, but her spine stayed straight. And I know what kind of man you are. You left your brother bleeding while you ran. Arthur froze. Who told you that? Thomas. His expression twisted. Then he's still lying. He took another step forward, and the sharp click of a rifle bolt stopped him cold. Thomas stood at the corner of the barn, hat low, rifle leveled. "Arthur," he said evenly, "I'm done running." The wind rose, whipping the grass around them. Arthur's jaw worked, his eyes wild. "You should have stayed gone, Hale." "I tried," Thomas said. "Didn't take." Catherine stood frozen between them, fear crawling up her throat. "You killed Sam," Arthur hissed. "No," Thomas said quietly. "You did, when you let him swing that knife drunk as he was. I tried to stop it." "Liar!" Arthur's hand went for his gun, but Catherine's voice cracked through the air. "Stop!" Both men froze. She stepped forward, shaking but unflinching. "Thomas, put it down. Arthur, listen to me. You came here for blood, but it won't bring peace." Arthur sneered. "You'd defend him? A killer?" "I'd defend truth," she said, her voice steady now, "and I believe God doesn't waste his mercy on the undeserving." Arthur hesitated. The wind howled between them like the breath of something unseen. Then from the distance came the pounding of hooves. Sheriff Latimer, coat flapping, shouting as he rode. "Hold your fire! It's over!" Arthur turned, startled. Latimer pulled up hard, raising his badge. "Arthur Leary, you're done stirring ghosts. I read the record. Your brother's death was ruled accident, Hale cleared by witness testimony you never stayed to give." Arthur's mouth opened, but no sound came. His shoulders slumped, the fury draining out of him like water through sand. He dropped his pistol into the dust. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Thomas lowered his rifle, his voice rough. "Go home, Arthur." Arthur looked at him, eyes hollow. "Ain't got one," he muttered, and turned to walk toward his horse. When he was gone, the silence that followed felt like the first deep breath after a storm. That evening, Catherine and Thomas sat on the bush as the sky blazed gold over the valley. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Catherine said, "Do you think it's over?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Maybe, or maybe it's just beginning." She turned her head toward him. "And what do you call this beginning?" He smiled faintly. "Grace, I think." She reached over, taking his rough hand in hers. "Then let's not waste it." From somewhere in the fields, a lark began to sing, a sound small and sure, like hope steadying itself in the quiet. By the time the sheriff's report made its way through Silverleaf, every porch in town had an opinion. Mrs. Dobbins at the bakery said she knew the widow Townsend's new husband had honest eyes. The blacksmith said he'd bet a week's wages Thomas could swing a hammer straighter than half the men in town. And at the general store, Clara Perkins told anyone who'd listened that she'd always believed Catherine had a good head for menfolk, even the tattered ones. But not everyone forgave so easily. Reverend Pritchard frowned when he heard. "Mercy's fine," he told the church ladies, "but so is caution. The Lord said to be wise as serpents, not blind as moles." By Sunday morning, Catherine knew she'd have to face them all. The bell rang clear in the autumn air as Catherine and Thomas walked up the church path together. Eyes turned. Conversations stopped. Catherine could feel the weight of every glance, the whisper of skirts, the quick shuffle of boots, the rustle of hymnals closing. She kept her chin lifted. Thomas walked beside her, coat brushed clean, hands empty, gaze steady. At the door stood Reverend Pritchard himself, blocking the entrance with a polite but rigid smile. "Mrs. Townsend," he said, nodding once. "Mr. Hale." "Reverend," Catherine replied evenly. "We've come to worship." "I see." His eyes flicked toward Thomas. "You've stirred quite the tale this week, sir." Thomas nodded slightly. "Seems I've had a few tales following me." "Some men bring storms with them," Pritchard said, "but I pray yours is spent. Then we'll pray together." Catherine said quietly and stepped past him before he could speak again. Inside, the church fell still as they took their seats. The sermon that day was from John 8. "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone." Catherine didn't know if the Reverend chose it out of providence or pointedness, but she didn't care. She held Thomas's hand through the prayer, her fingers laced tight with his. When the service ended, she expected the silence to follow them out. Instead, Clara Perkins came first, walking straight up, grinning wide, pressing a loaf of bread into Catherine's hands. "Town can talk all it likes," she said, "but I know a man's heart by how he fixes a fence. You two keep standing." Then, one by one, others came too. A nod from the blacksmith, a handshake from the storekeeper. By the time they reached the bottom of the steps, Catherine felt something she hadn't felt in years, belonging. A week later, Thomas put up a new sign at the edge of their land. Hale and Townsend Farmstead. He carved it himself, plain and sturdy. When he set it in the ground, Catherine stood beside him, sleeves rolled, her hair loose in the breeze. "You put my name first," she said with a small smile. "Seemed right," he replied. "You were here first." She tilted her head. "And you?" He leaned on the post, squinting toward the fields. "Guess I was just passing through, till you gave me reason to stay." She looked at the horizon, golden under the late harvest sun. "Then stay, Thomas Hale. We've enough ghosts buried." He turned to her. "And what do we build now?" "Something that lasts," she said simply. That night, as twilight deepened, they sat on the porch, watching the stars blink to life above the ridges. Catherine rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about the man you were before all this?" she asked. Thomas smiled faintly. "Only when I forget who I am now." "And who's that?" He looked at her, the lamplight flickering in her eyes, and said softly, "A man forgiven." Catherine nodded. "Then that's enough." A long silence settled between them, easy and good. The crickets sang. Somewhere, the church bell marked the hour. Catherine reached for his hand, whispering, "Thank you, Lord," under her breath, not for miracles, but for mercy found in the plain rhythm of days. The fields rolled gold and quiet under the harvest moon. For the first time in years, Catherine's barn was full, hay stacked neat, barrels of apples lining the wall, wheat tied in sheaves like bundles of sunlight. When Thomas came in from the field that evening, dust clung to his sleeves, but his grin was easy. "Looks like the Lord remembered us after all," he said. Catherine wiped her hands on her apron, smiling faintly. "He remembers better than we do." Thomas leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "I was thinking we might take some of the crop to town. Share what's extra." "With the Perkins family?" she asked. "With anyone who needs it," he said simply. "Seems wrong to hoard blessing." Catherine nodded. That was Thomas, quietly generous, never loud about faith, but always living it in action. When the moon rose high, she stood by the window, watching the fields shimmer silver, whispering a prayer of thanks. The air was cool, the night alive with crickets. It felt like peace could finally last. The peace didn't last. 2 weeks later, the clouds stopped coming. By the third week, the soil cracked. The wheat turned brittle. Wells ran low. Catherine woke at dawn to find the cattle restless, pawing at dry troughs. She and Thomas took turns drawing water from the creek a mile downhill, barely a trickle now. "Could be just a dry spell," Catherine said, trying to sound sure. Thomas glanced at the sky, hard and pale. "Could be," he said, but his tone didn't believe it. By August's end, the drought had bitten deep into Silverleaf. Crops failed, tempers flared, prayers rose heavier each Sunday. At the general store, men whispered that God had turned his back on the valley. Catherine refused to believe it, but even her faith began to ache under the weight of thirst. One evening, Thomas stood in the center of the field, turning a handful of dry soil through his fingers. It sifted like ash. He didn't see Catherine watching from the fence. He just stared at the ground as if trying to will it back to life. Finally, she walked out to him, the hem of her skirt brushing dust. He looked up, weary but calm. "I prayed last night," she said quietly. "Good," he murmured. "We'll need every word we can spare." "I didn't ask for rain," she said. He frowned slightly. "No? I asked for strength to wait for it." Thomas let out a long breath. "That's the harder prayer," she smiled faintly. "The one that gets answered slower too," he nodded. "Then we'll wait together." It was near dusk when the first cloud appeared, just one, thin as smoke. Catherine saw it first from the porch. She stood perfectly still, afraid that if she blinked it would vanish. Then Thomas came out, wiping his hands. He followed her gaze, then smiled softly. "It's not much," he said. "No," she whispered. "But it's enough." The wind shifted. The smell changed, damp and green like the memory of spring. Then came the first drop, cool and sharp against her cheek. She laughed out loud. Thomas took her hand, both of them standing in the open as the drizzle thickened into rain. Within minutes, the sound of it filled the valley, on rooftops, on parched ground, on the broad leaves of the apple trees. The earth drank greedily. The creek began to murmur again. Thomas raised his face to the sky. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered. Catherine smiled through the wet strands of her hair. "Told you, he remembers." The rain had been falling steady for 3 days. Not a downpour now, just a slow, soaking rhythm that the earth welcomed with open hands. Catherine was by the fire, mending a shirt of Thomas's when the knock came. 3 firm raps against the door, muffled by rain. Thomas glanced up from the table where he was sharpening his old hunting knife. Expecting anyone? No, Catherine said, setting the needle down. He rose, opened the door, and there stood a man she didn't recognize. He was tall but stooped with fatigue, his coat dark with water, his hat dripping. His eyes, though, were clear, a pale gray that carried both sorrow and gentleness. Evenin', he said quietly. Name's Alfred. Sorry to trouble you folks, but my horse threw a shoe down the ridge road. Been walking a spell. Thomas stepped back, gesturing him in. You're welcome to the fire. The man entered slowly, removing his hat. Much obliged, storm caught me unprepared. Catherine poured him a cup of coffee, her gaze lingering on the small satchel slung over his shoulder. It looked worn and important, the kind a man guards with his life. As he took the cup, he said, Truth is, I'm carrying a letter. Been looking for a Mrs. Catherine Townsend Hale. Guess I've found her. Catherine froze. Who's it from? Can't say. I was paid to deliver, not to pry. Man in Denver said it was urgent. Thomas exchanged a glance with her. She took the envelope with careful fingers, her name written in an unfamiliar, elegant hand. The seal was broken, but the letter inside was dry, as though it had been protected fiercely. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. Mrs. Hale, if this letter finds you, it is because your name reached me through the Denver records. I am executor of the late Matthew Townsend's estate, your first husband. In his final months before his passing, he placed a small sum in trust, intending it for your use should hardship come. The sum has lain dormant these 6 years due to an administrative error, recently uncovered. I've done what I can to secure it. If you are able, please send acknowledgement or come to Denver to sign the claim. It may not be much, but I suspect he would have wished it to reach you. Sincerely, George R. Weatherby, Solicitor of Denver City. Catherine lowered the page slowly. Thomas watched her face. What does it say? She passed it to him. His eyes skimmed the words, then he nodded once. Quiet. It's your husband's hand reaching from the past, Catherine. Her throat tightened. I thought there was nothing left, Clyde. I thought... Thomas touched her shoulder. Maybe it's a mercy meant for now, not then. Alfred sipped his coffee, saying softly, You're lucky, folks. Some letters carry only bad news. That night, they gave Alfred a place by the fire and a blanket. Rain drummed steady on the roof as they talked in the dim light. He told them he was a circuit courier, part messenger, part preacher when the road was long and lonely. Sometimes, he said, I think the Lord hides his messages in letters and strangers both. Thomas chuckled. Then I suppose he used both tonight. Alfred smiled faintly. Maybe so. Before bed, Catherine pressed a small tin of biscuits into his hands. For the road tomorrow, she said. He tipped his hat, his eyes kind. And for you, ma'am, a word. The drought broke when it needed to, not when you prayed loudest. Remember that. When morning came, he was gone, leaving only a set of footprints leading down the damp road and the faint smell of pipe smoke in the air. 2 weeks later, Catherine and Thomas rode into Denver, her first time seeing the city since her marriage. The solicitor's office was small and cluttered, but the man's eyes lit with recognition when he saw her. Mrs. Hale, indeed, it's an honor. He passed her a small pouch, heavy with coin and a single folded note, one written in Matthew Townsend's unmistakable hand. If ever this reaches you, know that my only wish was your peace. I could not give it in life. Perhaps I might in death. Catherine stood silent, tears warming her cheeks. Thomas reached for her hand. You've had 2 good men love you, Catherine, he said softly. She smiled through tears. One on earth, one in heaven. I think that's grace enough. The coins jingled faintly in the pouch as they rode out of Denver. The sky had cleared to a clean autumn blue, the kind that seemed to wash the world new again. Catherine kept the pouch tucked safely beneath her shawl, though she touched it now and again as though to be sure it was real. Thomas rode beside her, the reins loose in his hands. You're thinking of what to do with it, he said gently. I am, she admitted. It feels strange, having such a gift when so many around us have so little. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. What's on your heart? She smiled faintly. Something Matthew once said, we're only stewards of what God puts in our hands. Thomas's voice was quiet. Then maybe this isn't just an inheritance, Esfas, maybe it's a task. They rode the rest of the way in silence, the wind carrying the scent of pine and earth and far-off rain. By the time they reached Silverleaf, winter had begun its slow crawl down from the mountains. The air was sharper, the nights longer. The drought had left many farmers near ruin. A few of their neighbors, old Jacobson, the Collins family, were preparing to leave for the lowlands. At the general store, Catherine overheard Mrs. Collins telling the grocer, "We just can't make it another season. There's no seed money left." Catherine's fingers tightened around the coin purse inside her pocket. That night, she sat by the fire with Thomas, the flicker of flame reflected in his eyes. "I can't keep it," she said quietly. "Not all of it." Thomas didn't argue. He just nodded, waiting. "I want to use it to help the town, seed, supplies, maybe rebuild the old church roof." He smiled faintly. "Then that's what we'll do. It was given for peace. Let's sow it that way." The town meeting, word spread quickly that the Hales had called a gathering at the church. When Catherine stood at the front, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, she could feel the unease in the air. Folks were proud in Silverleaf, too proud to take charity, even from one of their own. Thomas stood beside her, steady and silent. Catherine spoke simply, her voice clear and even. "Years ago, this land gave to me when I had nothing. My late husband left a gift behind, a small one. I wanted to go back where it belongs, into the soil, into hands that will make it live again." Murmurs rippled through the room. Old Jacobson rose slowly. "You mean to give it away?" "Yes," Catherine said. "Not as charity, as investment. You'll pay it back when you can, with seed, with work, or with kindness. No interest, no ledger." The silence that followed was heavy, but something began to shift in it, like a thaw. Mrs. Collins wiped her eyes. "Bless you, Catherine Hale." The pastor stepped forward, placing a hand over his heart. "The Lord's work isn't always done from the pulpit," he said. "Sometimes it's done from the pocket." By spring, Silverleaf began to change. Fields that had lain empty were green again. The church roof was repaired, the town well was deepened. People spoke differently now when they passed Catherine in the street, not with pity or whisper, but with quiet respect. One evening, Clara visited, bringing a basket of apples and her broad, teasing grin. "You realize," she said, "you've gone and turned yourself into a legend." Catherine laughed softly. "A legend with dirt under her nails." "Still," Clara said, "I hope you know what you did matters. Folks say the drought ended, but truth is, you ended it first." Catherine looked out the window where Thomas was working in the yard and smiled. "No," she said, "we just gave what we were given." The sun was dropping low, brushing the wheat fields in molten light. Catherine was in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, when she saw a figure coming up the road. The man walked with a limp and carried a worn satchel slung over one shoulder. His clothes were dusty, his beard unkempt, but there was something about the set of his shoulders, familiar, guarded. Thomas straightened from where he was mending the fence. His hammer froze midair. "Thomas?" Catherine asked softly. "Do you know him?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "I do." The stranger stopped at the gate. "Didn't reckon you'd remember me, Hale," he said, his voice rough from the road. "I remember," Thomas said evenly. "You're Mason." The man nodded once. "That I am." Catherine glanced between them. "A friend?" Thomas's tone was calm, but his eyes weren't. "No. A debt." They stood across the fence like two ghosts from another life. Mason shifted, looking uneasy. "Didn't come here to stir up the past. He hesitated. "I needed work, heard Silverleaf's growing. Heard you was a decent man to ask." Thomas's hammer lowered slowly. The years between them seemed to hang heavy in the air. "You left me to hang, Mason," and he said quietly. "That's how I remember you." Catherine felt the words hit like a cold wind. Mason's face pinched. "I ran. You know I did. Didn't have it in me to fight those men. I thought they'd kill me too." "They nearly did," Thomas said. Silence. The fence creaked softly as Mason leaned on it. "I'm sorry," Mason said at last. "Ain't much good to you now, I know, but I thought maybe I could make it right." Thomas studied him for a long time. "You can't fix what's gone," he said, "but you can start over, if you mean to." Catherine placed a hand lightly on Thomas's arm. "We always said we'd help those who came to us honest," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "Then I suppose the offer stands." That night, Mason slept in the barn. The sound of rain began again, a soft, steady rhythm that filled the night. Catherine watched Thomas through the lamplight, the lines on his face deeper than usual. "You did right," she said gently. He shook his head. "I did what I could stomach. Forgiveness isn't the same as trust." "No," Catherine said, "but it's where trust begins." Thomas looked at her then, really looked. "When I first came here, you saw something in me no one else did. You believed a ragged man could be a husband. Maybe it's time I do the same for someone else." Catherine smiled softly. Then maybe the Lord's teaching us the same lesson, only from different sides. Outside, the rain washed over the roof in a soft, endless hush. By morning, Mason was already at the corral repairing the broken gate. His limp slowed him, but he worked steady without complaint. Thomas joined him silently, handing him nails, setting posts. Neither spoke for a long while. Finally, Mason said, "You could have sent me away." Thomas nodded. "I almost did." "What changed your mind?" Thomas drove a nail deep into the post. "Someone once took a chance on me when I didn't deserve it. Figured I'd return the favor." Mason looked down. "You'll get no trouble from me." Thomas wiped his hands. "Good. Then we start there." When Catherine brought them bread and coffee, she caught the faintest glimmer of something new in both men. Not yet friendship, but the fragile beginning of peace. Silverleaf's mornings were quiet in winter, but rumors had a way of traveling faster than wind. By noon, half the town had heard there was a new man working at the Hale place, a drifter, rough-looking, once seen in chains out west. At the general store, Mrs. Collins leaned over the counter toward Clara. "Mark me, Clara. No good comes of men like that. I heard tell he was mixed up in a killing years back." Clara shook her head, folding her arms. "And I heard Catherine Hale took him in. That's enough for me." But Mrs. Collins only sniffed. We'll see if her judgment holds when something goes missing. Outside, the sky had turned heavy and gray. Snow threatened at the edges of the horizon, thick and low. By mid-afternoon, Sheriff Alfred came riding up to the Hale farm, coat collar turned high against the wind. Thomas saw him first from the barn door and wiped his hands on his coat. "Afternoon, Sheriff," he said, voice even. "Cold day for a visit." The sheriff dismounted slowly. "Just came from town. Folks been talking about your new hand." Thomas's eyes hardened slightly. "Mason told me his story." "Did he tell you he broke jail in Kansas?" Thomas didn't flinch. "He told me he ran, and that he's here to make things right." Alfred studied him a long moment. "You know I like you, Hale, but you've got a wife, a good name, and half the town's respect. Don't gamble that on a man who already threw away his own." Catherine stepped from the porch, her shawl drawn tight. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "I invited him here as well. If you plan to take him, you'll have to go through me first." The sheriff blinked, taken aback. "I've seen what fear does to men," she continued. "It's easy to condemn from the comfort of the pew. Harder to forgive when you have to share a table." Alfred sighed. "You two have more faith than I do." "Maybe," Thomas said, "but faith's all that's kept this town alive." The sheriff tipped his hat. "Just keep him out of trouble. The snow's coming in hard tonight." By nightfall, the wind was howling. Snow fell in thick, twisting sheets, burying fences and fields alike. Inside, Catherine fed the fire while Thomas and Mason secured the shutters. The house creaked under the storm's weight, but held. When Mason came in, breath clouding in the cold, he looked uneasy. "I ought to leave come morning," he said. "Ain't right bringing trouble to your door." Thomas handed him a blanket. "You're not leaving till spring. We need the help, and you need a place." Catherine added, "And this is a Christian home. We don't send men into the storm." Mason looked from one to the other, eyes glistening faintly in the lamplight. "You two are either the kindest fools I ever met, or the bravest." "Likely both," Catherine said with a small smile. They sat in silence after that, listening to the wind beat against the windows like a living thing. The snowstorm lasted 3 days. When it cleared, Silverleaf lay quiet beneath a white world, clean, still, and new. Catherine and Thomas hitched the wagon to help dig out the neighboring farms. Mason came too, his limp slowing him, but his hands tireless. At Mrs. Collins's place, he helped pull her boy from a half-collapsed shed. The woman who had gossiped about him now couldn't speak through her tears. By the time the thaw came, folks no longer whispered when Mason walked into town. They nodded. Some even tipped their hats. At church that Sunday, Pastor Brooks paused mid-sermon and looked directly at the Hales. "Mercy," he said slowly, "isn't weakness. It's the strength to see a man not as he was, but as he's becoming." Thomas reached for Catherine's hand. She met his gaze, her heart full. The Lord's work, she thought, was never loud. It was done quietly in kitchens and barns, around fires on cold nights, and it always began with a choice. It began with the children. By midweek, 3 of them were home from the small schoolhouse with flushed faces and coughing fits that shook their small frames. At first, folks thought it was only a chill from the long winter, but by the second night, old Mrs. Collins's youngest boy couldn't breathe. By morning, the sound of hacking coughs echoed from every street. The doctor from Ridgeway was snowed in and couldn't reach them. Catherine, standing by the stove, felt her stomach twist when Clara came riding through the storm, her face pale and eyes wide. "Cat," she gasped, "it's bad. Mrs. Collins sent for you, says the boy's near gone." Without hesitation, Catherine wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and grabbed her satchel. "Thomas, hitch the team," she said. "We'll need warm water, blankets, vinegar, anything clean." He didn't ask why, he just moved. Mason appeared at the doorway, already pulling on his coat. "I'll come too." Catherine nodded once. "Good. We'll need every hand." The Collins cabin was thick with the smell of sickness and fear. The boy lay still on the bed, sweat soaking his hair, breath shallow and fast. Mrs. Collins knelt beside him, wringing her hands. "I've tried everything. Everything, Catherine. He's burning up." Catherine knelt, her movements calm and sure, voice gentle but firm. "Get me clean cloths and some vinegar. We'll cool him first." Mason fetched water from the well, the steam rising in the cold air. Thomas built the fire higher, his face grim. For hours, Catherine worked, bathing the boy's forehead, spooning water into his mouth, whispering prayers under her breath. When his breathing eased at last, Mrs. Collins collapsed in tears, clutching Catherine's hands. "You've saved him. Oh, Lord, you've saved him." Catherine shook her head. "No, ma'am. God did. We just helped him along." By the next day, half the town was sick. The fever spread fast, sparing neither young nor old. Catherine and Clara turned the church into an infirmary, lining the pews with blankets. Thomas carried wood for the stoves. Mason made trips back and forth through the snow, hauling water, food, and medicine. When even Pastor Brooks fell ill, Catherine found herself standing before the congregation of the suffering, leading them in prayer. Her voice shook, but did not falter. "Lord," she said softly, "you healed the broken. You fed the hungry. Do not forget your children here. Give us hands that do not tremble and hearts that do not turn away." Mason, overhearing her from the doorway, lowered his head. For the first time in years, he prayed too. That night was the worst. The fever took 3 of the older townsfolk before dawn. The wailing echoed through the snow. Exhausted, Catherine sat by a girl's bedside, her fingers trembling as she held a damp cloth to her brow. Thomas found her there, her face pale with fatigue. "You need to rest," he said. She shook her head. "If I rest, she won't wake again." Mason entered, his coat soaked with melting snow. "Doctor's on his way from Ridgeway," he said. "I met him halfway. He's bringing supplies." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "You went out in that storm?" He shrugged, breathless. "Couldn't sit by while folks died." Thomas gripped his shoulder, steady and firm. "You've paid your debt, Mason. More than paid." For a moment, the 3 of them stood together in the flickering lamplight. The widow, the ragged man, and the redeemed drifter, each bound not by pasts, but by mercy. When dawn came, the fever broke. The children began to stir, their breathing slow and even. By noon, the town knew. Silverleaf had survived. Catherine stepped outside the church into the pale sunlight. Snow still lay thick, but for the first time in months, she could hear the sound of laughter. Weak, fragile, but real. She closed her eyes, whispering, "Thank you." Thomas came to stand beside her, his arm warm around her shoulders. "You were his hands this week, Catherine." She looked up at him, smiling faintly. "So were you." From across the yard, Mason leaned against the fence, his hat in his hands. When their eyes met, he gave a small nod, a wordless promise that faith, once planted, had taken root. Winter melted slow in Silverleaf. Snow slid from the rooftops in steady dripping lines, and the air carried the scent of thawing earth. People moved differently now, lighter, slower, as if remembering what it meant to live without fear. Catherine stood in her garden one morning, turning over the soil with her spade. The dirt was soft again, pliant beneath her hands. Thomas leaned on the fence, watching her with a faint smile. "Never thought I'd see you with dirt on your face and a smile at the same time." She wiped her brow, laughing softly. "After what we've been through, dirt feels like a blessing." He chuckled. "I'll not argue that." Across the field, Mason repaired the last of the fence rails, his limp barely noticeable now. When Catherine waved to him, he tipped his hat, then turned back to his work with quiet purpose. For the first time since she'd come to Silverleaf, Catherine felt the hush in her chest lift. The world seemed to breathe again. By mid-spring, the town was alive with sound. The bell at the church, long cracked and silent, was newly repaired, its first ringing scattering birds into the sky. At the general store, laughter spilled through the door. Children ran barefoot through puddles. Neighbors shared bread and stories like people waking from a long sleep. And when Pastor Brooks returned to the pulpit, thinner but smiling, his first sermon wasn't about judgment. It was about gratitude. God didn't send us miracles, he said. He sent us each other. The congregation nodded, many glancing toward Catherine and Thomas, seated together in the second pew. Spring brought another joy, a wedding. Not Catherine and Thomas's, their vows were already written in quiet deeds and long nights, but Mason's. He had met Jane Collins during the long recovery. Her gentle heart had cared for him as she had for her own family. When the church bell rang that May morning, the town turned out in full. Mason stood nervously at the front, his hair combed for the first time anyone could remember. When Jane walked down the aisle, her simple dress gleaming white in the sunlit doorway, Mason's eyes filled. Catherine squeezed Thomas's hand as the pastor spoke the words. There was laughter, there were tears, and when the kiss came, the bell rang again, clear and strong across the fields. Outside, Clara turned to Catherine, smiling wide. Never thought I'd see the day that man found peace. Catherine watched the new couple step into the sunlight, the wind tossing petals around them. Peace, she said softly, always starts with mercy. That night, after the celebration ended and the lanterns along the road flickered low, Catherine and Thomas walked home through the fields. The stars hung bright over the mountains, and the air smelled of lilac and rain. Thomas slipped his arm around her. Think they'll remember all this? What was done here? Catherine looked out over the town, the rooftops glowing faintly in the starlight. Maybe not by name, she said, but they'll remember the kindness. It'll live in the way they raise their children and how they treat a stranger. Thomas nodded. That's enough. They reached the porch, and Catherine paused to listen. Far off, faint but clear, the church bell rang again, softly like a heartbeat. Catherine smiled. That sound, she whispered, it means home. Catherine woke to birdsong. The morning light slipped through the lace curtains, golden and warm. For the first time in years, she didn't wake to worry or to-do lists, only the calm rhythm of breath beside her and the steady heartbeat of the house they'd built together. Thomas was already up, stoking the fire. She heard the low scrape of the poker, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted in from the kitchen. She rose quietly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped out onto the porch. The fields stretched before her, green, full, alive. The wheat whispered in the wind like prayer. Thomas joined her, 2 steaming cups in hand. He passed one to her and leaned on the railing. Looks like the year's going to be good, he said. It feels good, she replied softly. The kind of good that lasts. He nodded toward the road. Town's already stirring. Clara says they're planning a harvest fair, come autumn. First in years. Catherine smiled. After all that's happened, I think we've earned a little celebration. Later that day, they visited the church. Doors stood open, with sunlight streaming through the stained glass, scattering color across the floor. Mason and Jane were there, sweeping, laughing softly together as they cleaned. Jane waved when she saw them. We thought we'd help the pastor tidy up before service tomorrow. Catherine smiled. You two seem happy. Mason grinned. Never thought I'd see my name spoken kind in a church again. Feels like God turned me inside out and gave me a second go. Thomas clasped his shoulder. You earned it, Mason. Maybe, Mason said, but I think you gave it first. For a long moment, the 4 of them stood there in the sunlight, each shaped by hardship, each forgiven, each changed. That afternoon, Catherine walked to the far edge of the property where the new wheat field began. A small wooden cross stood there, weathered, simple, carved with a single name, Matthew Townsend. She knelt and pressed her palm against the earth. Thank you, she whispered, for the seeds that started all this. When she rose, Thomas was there watching quietly. Do you ever think about what's next? He asked. She smiled. I used to be afraid of that question. Now I just trust that tomorrow's already in his hands. He reached for her hand, rough and warm. Then let's meet it together. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the town gathered for supper at the churchyard. Tables lined the grass, lanterns swung in the breeze, laughter and hymns filled the air. Children ran between the benches, their hair catching the light. The bell rang one clear note to begin grace. Pastor Brooks lifted his hands. Tonight, he said, we give thanks not for what we lost, but for what was found: faith, mercy, and each other. Catherine's gaze drifted to Thomas beside her, to Clara's loud laughter, to Mason and Jane holding hands across the table. When the prayer ended, Thomas leaned close. You know, he murmured, I think your letter all those months ago, your bold choice, it saved more than just us. Catherine smiled, eyes bright in the lantern light. Maybe it did, but I think we were all just answering one another's prayers. As the stars rose, Catherine stepped a little away from the crowd to watch. The sound of music drifted softly across the fields, the fiddle, the laughter, the quiet hum of peace. Thomas came to stand beside her, his arms circling her shoulders. Do you hear that? She whispered. He tilted his head. What? The sound of joy. He smiled. Best sound there is. She rested her head against him. We've come a long way, Thomas Hale. He looked out over their land, their people, their lighted town. A long way, he said, and somehow I think we're just getting started. The lanterns flickered like stars on the earth below, and above them, heaven's stars shimmered in answer, bright, steady, eternal. And for the first time in many long years, Catherine believed completely in tomorrow.